Alright everybody, welcome back to Fleet Admiral Diaz, and we'll start off with New Eden, which is where we get a brief recap of Pike coming on the Discovery from Enterprise, the mysterious red bursts, which most people think are something to do with the Iconians in another cannon smash, the grabbing of that asteroid to interact with dark matter, even though Archer and T'Pol did that like 100 years ago, hints of how the magic mushrooms apparently retain the soul of someone, and of course the family drama between Space Sasha and her brother Spork. Alright, so at the outset of the episode we get this kind of a rehash exposition. Spock talking about how his mother suggested he draw out his nightmares, actually like draw them, in order to destroy the power that they had over him. And, from a technical aspect, I gotta say, it was a beautiful shot of the Discovery. I really don't like the design of the ship in general, but it was pretty impressive visuals. That's never really been a problem for this show. Well, it ends up that this is actually Burnham playing back the audio log she lifted from Spock's quarters along with his tablet, that little thief. Pike figures out that the drawing near perfectly matches the rendering of the red bursts. Then Burnham insists that they find or contact Spock to see what else he might know, but Pike lets her in on him being in a psych ward on a starbase. Now, this scene was actually quite humanizing for both characters, in my opinion. I still maintain that Burnham is utterly superfluous, and her very existence wrecks so much about Spock. But the acting here actually made it seem like she cared and felt guilt over how they left off, which she brings up when Pike suggests she reach out to Spock even though he insisted his family not be contacted. So, she doesn't feel as if he will want to hear from her. Frankly, if I were him, I know I wouldn't. And Burnham has an opportunity to confide in Pike about what she saw down on the planet, the red angel figure. Instead, she opts to lie rather than go on, finish her thought about mentioning this, and she thanks him, and of course he says, "You're welcome." Pike gets called to the bridge over another red burst. They can't get a fix on it, so Tilly was trying to do some technobabble using the deflector and gravimetric pulses to act like sonar. Yeah, that again. Anyway, Sasha suggests that it's too far, so they should go to warp and target it with long-range sensors when they come out. More on that in a second. So Pike has them jump to maximum warp for 5 seconds. They somehow figure out this burst is over 50,000 light years away in the beta quadrant, so one has to wonder just how long range are long-range sensors, and why didn't it take an insane amount of time to get a return on the ping method Tilly suggested. Anyhow, it's estimated that it would take 150 years at maximum warp to get there, so Pike winds up getting the rundown on how the magic mushrooms worked, so they can use the spore drive instead. A couple of things here. I've seen the argument made that the Klingons and other known powers are in the beta quadrant, so it can't be that far away. Well, most maps of the Milky Way for Trek have the Federation straddling the line between the alpha and beta quadrants, and the Klingons and Romulans deeper on into the beta quadrant. The only way I can surmise that this burst is in the beta quadrant while being over 50,000 light years away is if it's similarly on the borderline between beta and delta. Now, Voyager was thrown about 70,000 into the delta quadrant, which brings up another serious nitpick. They're going to cover two-thirds the distance Janeway and company had to figure out how to get across in under 70-odd years in the blink of an eye. Yet, this show supposedly respects canon. Okay. Also, along with this, were warp engines really about half as fast in this era as in the TNG era? I ask because at around 70,000 light years away, it would have taken Voyager over 70 years to get home. At Discovery's max, it would take them 150 to cross roughly 20,000 light years less distance, according to dialogue. Now, this just stood out as a sore thumb, but I guess anything's possible given the change in warp scales and whatnot. Then we get a ghost story from Stamets about seeing his dead husband when he was trapped in the mycelial network and how Hugh inspired him to escape when he was going to give up. So he credits his dead life partner with saving them from the mirror universe and getting them home, which is all well and good as far as the spore drive and all the pseudo-scientific baggage it carries goes. This is just another instance of the same. So Tilly acts weirded out. They get pressed to make the jump, so they do, and Disco does something that Janeway would have probably killed and otherwise screwed over countless more people to do over a century later. They cross 50,000 light years in a split second. Stamets storms off afterward, and Tilly will wind up trying to mess with that rock they have from the last episode to try and just on the fly invent an inorganic interface for the spore drive. When they get where they're going, they pick up no ships or any sign of technology, but a bunch of humans on an M-class planet. They apparently live in a pre-warp state, and there's a distress beacon from the World War III era on Earth, which has been transmitting since before warp drive was invented. By like 10 years. So Pike insists that if they beam down, they have to abide by General Order 1, aka the Prime Directive, because the fact these people ended up here 10 years before a budding alcoholic invented warp drive means they're too primitive to handle being visited by Starfleet. Sorry, that just hit me as a bit silly, but I guess it's either possible the writers were trying to make Pike seem like a stickler hard-ass, or they assumed that being super firm and uncompromising about the invention of warp drive as a marker for the level of a society would make them seem more respectful of canon. After some background between Pike, Burnham, and Saru concerning the planet and, the particulars of going down there, we cut to Tilly trying to get some of the asteroid fragment loose to try and mess with it, as mentioned earlier. Even a tiny amount apparently weighs literally tons and smashes her cart of tools when it floats free and lands on it. Wait a minute. How the heck did Burnham just pick up a fist-sized chunk of this stuff down on the asteroid planetary body in the premiere episode? That girl must be juicing something fierce. Anyway, something happens, and the captured rock fragment pulses and knocks the bejesus out of Tilly. As goofy as she's been this season, it bothered me to see her hurt like this. I didn't really care for her B-plot here all that much, but I more or less get the idea behind it. After relegating poor Tilly to have her fate explored after another segment of A-plot, and another nice shot of the ship where it's flying inverted over the planet, Pike takes Burnham and the ops officer lady whose name I have honestly given up trying to pronounce without sounding silly and uncultured, because she apparently lived in a Luddite collective. For those who don't know, Luddites are kind of like Amish in that they reject modern technology and such. So Sasha's logic is that she'll help her and Pike blend in, even though she has barely any interaction with the people when they're down there. So then they beam smack dab into the middle of town. Some dialogue to indicate that no one was in that general area would have been nice. As it stands, I was left wondering how no one saw them just materialize in a beam of light. Anyway, the three of them go into the church they saw from orbit. Pike seems reverent when he asks if the other two have ever been in a church before. Ops lady is from a family of non-believers. I think atheists would have flowed better here, but that's just me. Burnham states that she's familiar with the texts of Earth's religions, which isn't really what Pike asked, but anyway, they poke around and surmise these people combined every major faith on Earth into one. Now that's a concept that gets very little elaboration, but I assume it was meant to further the notion that all faiths are created equal. So Burnham ends up getting fixated on some stained glass which shows the Red Angel, and a local man bursts in on them and asks why they aren't out working in the fields. Yeah, he asks why people he's never seen before in what looks to be a tight-knit small community aren't out working. Well, Pike BS's him about how they're from the north. He also gives up a name for ops lady that I can say, so Joanne it is. And the local man, whose name is Jacob, he kinda tacitly accepts all this, for now. Next we see a prayer of sorts, or a recounting of these people's history. Joanne looks more reverent than Pike while this is going on, and Burnham is wooden as usual. In any case, all of these folks are apparently descendants of people who shut up inside that church 200 years ago, right before being nuked, and were saved by the Red Angel. So their reasoning for mixing all those faiths was because they couldn't rightly ascribe their salvation to any one, so they went with a smorgasbord. There's mention that they hadn't had lighting in the church or anywhere else in a long time, and all they have are decaying relics of technology from the time of their arrival. Sasha gets interested by the mention of a helmet cam from one of the soldiers in the church back then, but the faith leader lady acts dismissive of the whole thing since the cam is busted and they don't need proof of their being saved. Pike asks to take shelter in the church, and the lady says yes, so they go back to keep investigating the signal and now maybe look for that camera. Burnham acts surprised at Pike answering the church lady's statement of peace be with you, and also with you, but she doesn't outright take a dump on him for it, so, there's that. Tilly wakes up in sickbay after getting ragdolled and talks to an imaginary friend for a bit before Saru comes in, half-ass berates her for trying to work on the asteroid fragment alone, then softens up when she explains she was doing it to try and help Stamets because she thinks interacting with dark matter will allow them to come up with an alternate set of controls for the spore drive. Saru keeps being a softie and just warns her not to be reckless in the future, though she's still in the command training program, God help us. He gives her this pep talk, eerily puts a weird hand on her shoulder, and then tells her she is important before running off to the bridge. On the bridge, unnamed Asian guy and Detmer tell Saru that the radioactive debris making up the planet's belts or rings is unstable and a bunch of it is going to rain down on the planet and kill everyone down there. Comm Officer Bryce tells them that they can't get a signal to Pike. Robot Lady Ariam, see, I remembered some of their names, points out that they can't beam them up either. No shuttle, because according to a guy whose specialty is fungus, the exhaust would create a positive feedback to the radiation. Stamets shows up to work a problem which really isn't in his field. I feel better already. Saru postulates that this is why they were brought here, and there goes the heroic bridge crew to prevent nuclear winter, which is just over an hour away. So back on the planet, Pike figures that the beacon they picked up must have been on all this time, without anyone even realizing it somehow. So instead of resting in the church, they go down to the cellar and start looking for the source, not to mention the helmet cam. The idea being that if they do that, no one else will come and disturb the people, but the broadcast frequency can barely reach orbit. So, hey, whatever. There's a debate between Sasha and Pike over leaving the people here. Burnham can't stand letting people wallow in their ignorance when they have any kind of beliefs, but Pike says that even though the inventor of warp drive and his entire generation are the exact same stock of people as these, the locals are too primitive to not have their development tampered with. It's just a little bit of editorializing here. Yes, I know, you could make the same argument for First Contact, but that wasn't really the same. Now, in that case, the Prime Directive was secondary to preventing damage to the timeline, causality, temporal paradoxes, all of that stuff. During this argument, Burnham tiptoes just this side of completely dumping on religion, but calls the local faith a lie anyway. Jacob bursts in on them again, and he goes on about knowing that they must be from Earth, and they heard the signal his family had been tending to this whole time. Which brings up another point. There hasn't been enough power to run the lights, let alone anything else, but this guy's family has been magically powering this distress beacon for this whole time. Think about all the blenders and other everyday conveniences that this magic power source could have run. Anyway, Pike and company stick to their cover story. Burnham really wants to tell Jacob the truth, and Jacob isn't buying it. He says he saw Iwoshikun. Hey, I just said Joanne's surname. Using an iPad version of a tricorder to find the beacon. And Pike feebly argues that that thing's always been in his family. So they try to take off on Jacob, but he throws a flashbang at them, which acts more like a phaser on stun. Because by the time the away team is up and mobile, Jacob is gone with all their stuff, including the phasers Pike told them to keep handy, but out of sight upon arrival. Jacob also locked them in the cellar. Well, you know, while they were passed out. So Joanne and Burnham get to work on getting them free, and Pike is still recovering from the flashbang, despite being the one furthest from it, behind these two when it went off. Pike figures Jacob stole their stuff to try and prove that the visitors are from Earth. Joanne uses a magnet she found down there to open the slide bolt from this side, and off they go. Of course, Pike reminds them not to break their cover under any circumstances. Back up in orbit, they're running out of time to keep that radiation from killing everyone down on the surface. Now, not that I mind Stamets in general as a character, but let me remind you, he is an astromycologist, aka Space Fungus Specialist. Memory Alpha does somehow list him as the chief engineer, but that makes about as much sense as Tig Notaro's character in the prior episode being capable of operating on people despite the fact she was an engineer and not a doctor. This show plays so fast and loose with the specializations that one might be forgiven for thinking it's Star Trek Online and the senior officers can just swap out one for the other whenever they want. Anyway, Tilly is talking to herself and complaining about not being able to figure out a way to help the current situation. She even makes a crack about Burnham not being around to yes and her like in an improv skit. Then she goes from talking to herself to talking to that lispy ghost from before. Now, between the two of them, they figure out an odd plan involving that big rock they trashed the shuttle bay to pull in last episode. Then we get the standard "I'm so smart, let me run out the door and then have to run back because I went the wrong way" gag at Tilly's expense. Now, Jonathan Frakes directed this, folks. I didn't realize he was so big on cliches. On the bridge, where they're almost out of time, unnamed Asian guy suggests blasting the rings with their phasers. But Robot Lady Ariam says it would only further concentrate the radiation. Now, I thought nadions broke matter apart at the subatomic level, but maybe these pew-pew phasers are different. So Tilly comes in wearing a gown, and Saru gets fake mad at her for leaving sickbay. She talks over him and volunteers Detmer to fly the ship in a donut while towing the fragment behind them and then letting it go. Detmer says she would have to start the loop from inside the ring, so Stamets runs comically to go do what he logically should have been in the engine room to do instead of working on the bridge in the first place. Man, it's a good thing the turbo lifts weren't down for some odd reason. So back on the planet, Jacob unloads all his pilfered gear in front of their faith leader lady, like she's a fence or something, and tells her if she just looks through it, she'll believe what he's saying. And Pike walks up and gives a lesson on the 8th commandment, which Jacob tries to shrug off and justify. Pike just wants his stuff back so they can leave, but Jacob goes off on a rant about being able to go home with them. The church lady admonishes him for living by the old, corrupt ways. Jacob appeals to Burnham because he knows she is the scientist and wants to tell them the truth, but Jacob's daughter, I guess, plays with a phaser and Pike dives on it like a grenade. Of course, we know he won't die, but this takes prequel plot armor to a whole new level. If that was an overload setting, he would be a lot worse off than some busted ribs and burns, as is said later. Anyway, Burnham, to her credit, plays along with their cover and asks for help, taking Pike back to the church in order to pray for another deliverance. Back up in orbit, they do the jump, then the donut maneuver, and draw all the radioactive rocks away from the planet. Admittedly, this looked cool enough and made sense given the stated high mass of the fragment, but then they apparently just let it fly off along with all those deadly rocks. And this is where plots A and B meet, since they're able to beam the away team up and do so right as Jacob crashes into the church after them. So him, his daughter, and the spiritual leader witness the transport, but of course it'll be interpreted as divine intervention by most of the people there. On Discovery, everybody celebrates saving the planet and the away team. Saru encourages Tilly to contradict him. Tilly gets congrats from the ghost girl again. And then Pike wakes up with some messed up ribs, which really makes me wonder how an indestructible guy like him will even get messed up by delta radiation later on. Tilly looks back through her junior high school records from Musk Junior High. Yep. After some computer searches, she realizes her invisible friend died years earlier. Very spooky. So Pike and Burnham discuss what went on. He thanks her for holding their cover together, and she decides to tell him about the Red Angel she saw last episode. They have this little debate about the implications of ascribing providence to these sightings and what took place at each one. They discuss Jacob and how they could put to rest his family's quest for the truth. Pike argues against it. Burnham says they should at least try to get the camera footage, and that since the red bursts are a top priority for them to investigate, it's up to Pike to weigh that against holding to General Order 1. Pike ends up beaming down and sees Jacob in the cellar, and, they discuss all the day's events. Pike explains why they lied about where they were from and gives an explanation of transporter technology as well as the Federation. Jacob is just thankful to know the truth, so he turns off the beacon and they make a trade between a helmet cam for a power cell. I guess just giving away 23rd century tech is okay by Pike's brass tack standards, but then again, Jacob seems like the type to keep his mouth shut. Anyway, Pike beams out and Jacob hooks up the cell to power the church lights, which of course is a big deal to everyone in town. Pike watches the cam footage and stares on in amazement after the angel appears on it. And then we go to credits and previews. Alright, some closing thoughts here. Comparison that I've seen and heard when it comes to this episode was it is very similar to an episode of, say, Stargate SG-1, where you have the undeveloped or underdeveloped society, and they're going and meeting and talking to them and trying to avoid being, I don't know, perceived of as gods or what have you. In this case, the dynamic was a little bit different, but still quite similar. I would say that it was probably handled better in shows like that. In this case, it was a little bit clunky, all in all. That being said, the A and the B plots, neither of them were really that bad. They certainly didn't drag or anything. Quite the opposite. It's pretty fast-paced. Seemed like the episode didn't really slow down ever. It was just constantly going and going. And, there's something to be said for that, but at the same time, sometimes the audience needs to be able to digest things. And I guess you could say, well, that's where repeat viewings come in, but, you know, production values and everything aside, and I do have to give the show credit for that, visually and technically is, you know, I would say one of the best productions out there right now. But the narrative, just, it still isn't really there, and I'm still very worried about these angel figures and what they represent. But that being said, if you enjoyed the review and want to see more, just go ahead and send me a like, subscribe, go ahead and follow, and hope to see you around again. Thank you.